Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar, today's webinar on presenting the SC for All's new report, The Chilling Prospects, Tracking Sustainable Cooling for All, 2019. Today's presentation, I'm joined here with my colleagues Ben Hartley and Clotilde Schio-de-Rossi. We will present you the key findings and give you an overview of what the report is about. The presentation will be divided into different sections. My colleague Clotilde is going to present you the fast action on access to cooling, as well as trends in cooling access, presenting the report. I will present you later on the focus on finance, our findings on finance and recommendations and next steps. And my colleague Ben is going to then introduce you to our Cooling for All needs assessment, a new concept that we are introducing in the report. So as many of you might know already, cooling is just to also remind you, at the end of the presentation, after my colleague Ben's presentation, we're going to have a Q&A session. I think there is a Q&A box where you can include your questions, and at the end, we're going to answer your questions. Thank you very much. To start with this presentation, I'm going to quickly show you, present, as many of you know, the intersection between cooling and access to sustainable cooling and the SDGs. As you know, access to cooling is really imperative when it comes to achieving the SDG, especially SDG 7 on sustainable energy for all and how to achieve them, as well as SDG 13 on climate action. So these are the two overarching SDGs, but in additional, we have also identified a couple of other SDGs that are very well connected or directly connected to access to cooling. So SDG 2 on zero hunger is very important when it comes to access to cooling. Each year we found out that food loss and waste costs about $1 trillion and account for 8 to 10% of annual GHG emissions. And especially low-income countries suffer the greatest food loss and waste. With sub-Saharan African loss of fruit and vegetables is due largely to the lack of reliable cold chains. And globally, food loss and waste account to, as mentioned again, 0 to 8 of annual GHG emissions. So SDG 2 is very directly linked to having a more access to cooling. SDG 13 on good health and well-being. This is important because unreliable medical cold chain threaten the effectiveness of vaccines and medical supplies. We also found the report also shows that only 41% of healthcare facilities in 78 low and middle income countries had reliable energy access necessary to power refrigerator and air conditioners. So you can understand the importance of access to cooling when talking about SDG 13. SDG 5 on gender equality. As you know, women and girls are often disproportionately impacted by a lack of access to sustainable cooling, especially women in agriculture. Women in agriculture labor roles often have fewer assets, cold chain breakdowns within the supply chain, and hence these women are disproportionately affected due to because of lack of access to cooling. SDG 7, as mentioned, is almost directly linked to access to cooling. Globally, as of today, 840 million people lack access to electricity necessary to power a light bulb. And so you can imagine how this being able to power more energy demanding appliances such as an AC and a refrigerator can be. For SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, we know that annual productivity loss due to heat could be as high as 2 trillion by 2030. The same for SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities. We found that at 2 degrees of warming, in the absence of cooling adaptation measures, hot cities could really experience annual deadly heat waves. And I think knowing that this is a global, international audience that we have now today in the webinar, I'm sure that the last 2-3 years we've really experienced how it is to with these warming days. So you can really understand how the importance of SDGs and the importance of access to cooling and how they relate so well to the SDGs. So this is just a very short overview of how access to cooling is linked into into the development issues. It's not just a luxury issue, it's really how it's going to help us achieve our goals. So I'm passing now the baton to Clotilde Schio-de-Roche, who's going to present the fast action on access to cooling.
Thank you, Alice. So on the fast action on access to cooling, so in the report, we have identified several actions that are happening at different levels, and we will go through some examples in the next slides. On the first field, which we defining targets for the critical 9. So in Chilean prospects, we have defined 52 countries which are at highest risk, and of these 9 has been defined as critical, as these countries per number of population are mostly exposed to having lack to access to cooling. Of these 9 countries, some of them have already developed national cooling plans. Some have a plan which is a work in progress, and for some the work hasn't started yet. So in particular, 5 of these countries are in Asia, and 2, which are actually the largest by population, India and China, have already developed the national cooling plans. And these plans are aimed to reduce cooling demand, to increase overall efficiency of cooling appliances, to reduce refrigerant demand, and also to reduce the demand for electricity and energy requirements. The other countries that are working now on the development of national cooling plans are Brazil, Nigeria, and Bangladesh, while the countries that haven't started yet are Indonesia, Sudan, and Mozambique, and Pakistan. We also would like to highlight the role of Rwanda. So Rwanda has, as first country, developed a national cooling strategy, where they have seen cooling and access to cooling as an holistic field. So not only focusing on appliances, but also looking at sustainable cooling through all its different measures, also on cold chain, with a cold chain strategy. We highlight also activities that has happened not only at a national level, but also at city level. In particular, the city of Ahmedabad in India is the first city in South Asia that has developed a heat action plan. The version of 2018 of this heat action plan, again, is a very forward-looking and has different aspects. So it's advocates for a greater use of cool roofs that are able to decrease the temperature and of the indoor temperature of the buildings that have a reflective roof. also specific training for medical professionals in order to be able to address the symptoms and to treat appropriately people that have been exposed to extreme heat, and also awareness campaign for people to be safe and to take all necessary measures in order to avoid risks to their health while heat waves are present. On cooler agriculture and in general agricultural cold chain, many initiatives has been ongoing, as already said by Alice. Access to food through cold chain is very important, and also food as a waste has a major impact, and agriculture altogether, but food as a waste due to broken cold chains has a major impact on the GHG emissions. So we highlight the initiative from CLASP, which has off-grid cold chain challenge. And they have given 10 innovation awards in 2018 to companies that have been developing particularly interesting technologies. And also we have seen several initiatives in which there were some form of sharing of coal shelves. So for example, in coal hubs in Nigeria, pay as you store is a possibility to utilize in a pay-as-you-go model, shelf that is shared at a community level by different people, also to extend the life of food. The role of industry is extremely important. Industry is there to develop technology that can be affordable to base of the pyramid population, and to create technology which is more efficient. So the Rocky Mountain Institute Global Cooling Prize is a cooling prize that has been conceived to find the technology which has 5 times less climate impact and does not cost more than 2 times what is the current AC unit. Last week, the 10 finalists were nominated. So we are looking forward to hear then more and to follow this prize. On private-public partnerships, we have highlighted few in the report. Here, for example, WWF and MPEG are using a mobile pay-as-you-go business. So the business model where you pay as you go, and this is applied to fishermen for off-grid solar cooling solution in Kenya. And we mention here also the Cool Coalition, which is a global multi-stakeholder network where more than 80 partners have joined. It's not only industry, but also countries and NGOs, organizations, which focus on a rapid transition to a more sustainable and efficient cooling. Fast action on access to cooling is also on capacity building and skill development. So we have seen several initiatives where we have several organizations are focusing also on the importance of skill development and in qualifying and training more people that are able to utilize new cooling appliances, also because maintenance is a key component for having cooling system work appropriately. Another initiative is from UN Environment, also on action, together with United for Efficiency, where different trainings have been happening in more than 150 countries, where more than 240 officials have been trained. And we have highlighted also in our report GIZ Proclima, which has a very strong program in promoting natural refrigerants and also creating training program for just allow people to get more familiar with natural refrigerants and also to how to improve energy efficiency overall. So In this next section, then trends in cooling access, we would like to address the population at risk, and also what information have changed or how the gap has moved from last year, the first version of Chilling Prospects, and this year. So in Chilling Prospect, last year in 2018, we have identified as first which kind of population are at risk and at what level of risk they are, depending on their income level, depending on where they live and whether they have access to electricity, they have access, they can have a fan, they can utilize a refrigerator. So in particular, the two categories mentioned on the left of the slide, so rural poor and urban poor, are the categories at higher risk because they don't have access to an intact cold chain, they don't have access to electricity. If they do have access to electricity, it's intermittent, and they typically live in housing of poor quality, and they also, their access to vaccines or to medicine is typically through cold chains that are not fully functioning. The other category is lower middle income, is a population that are able probably to afford the first air conditioner. But in many cases, this air conditioner is likely inefficient, as is the most affordable one, which is on the market. And typically this can affect the energy, overall energy consumption, and also the GHG emission, also depending on what kind of refrigerant is inside this unit. Middle income are a population which is at low risk, and we have identified it just to be able to track some of the movements and in which kind of way the access to cooling has changed. So the rural poor, these are likely to be subsistence farmers that don't have access to an intact cold chain. They don't have access to electricity, and also their vaccines and the medical cold chain is not present or is not unbroken. So the number of the rural poor are 365 million. We see this number has decreased by a little bit more than 100 million from last year. This is due mostly by two things. One is the massive increase or the significant increase in rural access that happens mostly in India. And the second reason is urbanization. What we would like to point out at this point is that this is a very positive message, but access to electricity doesn't tell us actually how stable and reliable the grid is, and doesn't tell us necessarily that all these people got a fan or got anything that would fix their cold chain, but still it's a very positive sign. Urban poor, this number increased from 630 million last year to 680 million this year. This is mostly due by growing urbanization in Africa and Asia. The lower middle income group is a very large group, is about 2.2 billion people, and has been defined as the proportion of population living on less than $10 per day, and is not excluding the rural or urban poor populations. This number has slightly decreased by 100 million from last year, and this has been associated, this changed mostly with the purchase of cooling devices and also income growth in this specific sector. findings by region. So still the highest percentage of population at risk, at highest risk, so urban and rural poor, is in Asia. Is almost 60% of the total population, while 35% is in Africa. But what you see on the map, the darkest color show the percentage of population at risk over the total population. So in some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, more than 56% of the population is at risk. This means, and there are 12 countries that have over 60% of the population at high risk. So as an overview, 52 countries have been defined as countries at risk and have been looked in depth in this report. The critical 9 that we have seen in the first slides with national cooling plans have started to develop national cooling plans and starting to looking into cooling in more depth in the last year. So China and India developed their national cooling plans that were published earlier this year. Bangladesh, Brazil, and Nigeria are working now on their national cooling plans. So wrapping up, we have 1.5 billion people that still are at higher risk compared to the 1.1 billion of last year. Energy access is very important to lower risk exposure, but it does not necessarily mean that the population that got energy access to electricity have a better access to cooling. And also the changes in volume do not necessarily imply that there was a transition from one population at risk to another. On this, I would like to give the baton back to Alice.
Thank you, Clotilde. So we're now going to present to you the chapter on finance. The report presents let's say the trends and the gaps when it comes to finance towards sustainable access to cooling. But in respect for this short presentation, we're going to focus on the innovative approaches that we have identified and presented in the report. So this year, as part of the innovation approaches, 2019 has really been fruitful when it came to prizes, as shown earlier by Clotilde. One of the prizes is the Rocky Mountain Institute Global Cooling Prize. This is a prize led by the RMI together with the government of India, which offers a 3 million prize as an incentive for research and development of sustainable room air condition with 5 times less climate impact than the base units, and especially no more than twice the cost. And this is something really that can really allow those identified and those presented by Clotilde earlier, the bottom of the pyramid, to really have access to an efficient appliance. I also have to note that this is primarily for the Indian market, but this is really hopefully also starting the interest in other markets and to develop this type of efficient appliances. The second one is the community cooling hubs. This is developed by the National Center for Cold Chain Development, the Shakti Foundation, and the University of Birmingham. This is a shared resource to reduce food waste and does allow access to higher value markets, but at the same time also provide relief in extreme heat. Again, this is really a focus where those who can usually not afford expensive or inaffordable appliances, to really give them access to these opportunities. The third one is the Rwanda Coolies, developed by Rwanda Green Fund, the Business Development Fund of Rwanda, and together with the Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy, or BASE. So the Rwanda Coolies is a financial leasing mechanism completed with a service agreement in which customer can access highly efficient cooling equipment through a financial lease. Again, this is something that we wanted to highlight because it really allows those who usually don't have access to these type of opportunities to do so. Another innovative approach is also developed by the Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy. This is the cooling as a service. It's a pay-as-you-go model for cooling that enables customers to base their investment decision on life cycle cost rather than on the purchase price of the equipment. So the cooling as a service is done by a technology provider who is backed by a financial institution and a guarantee provider, being the insurance company. And the technology provider can then lease an efficient equipment to customers. And then being backed by these stakeholders, the risk really to lease this type of high efficient equipment decreases, and also allow those who need it to access these type of technologies. So these are some of the approaches, innovative approaches. We've identified some of the trends that we've noticed, but the chapter on finance goes deeper into what needs to be done to really scale up financial solutions towards access to cooling. I'm going to move forward to the recommendation and next steps identified in the report. We have made recommendations for different stakeholders, as well as the next steps that they need to take. For the government policy makers, we really recommend them to develop comprehensive cooling plans that protect the vulnerable. As we've seen earlier in the presentation, many governments have come up with national cooling plans, and this is something that more governments are now looking into and really should. Another recommendation is to conduct a cooling for all needs assessment. This is something that Ben is going to present for a little bit after myself. But this cooling for all needs assessment will allow the governments to set targets and aggregate policy and technology options, and really strengthen the solutions that they can provide to their population. For donors, development practitioners, and financiers, they should prioritize interventions that support human safety, nutritional outcomes, and agricultural incomes, as well as medical services. These stakeholders can also harness a diverse set of finance tools to deliver cooling for all, including public-private partnerships. Industry really can play a very important role. They can provide efficient and affordable solutions for those at the base of the pyramid. They have sustained technological innovation that drives price reductions and overcome high upfront costs, which is usually one of the main barriers to have access to cooling technologies. They can also have an important role to play when it comes to skills development, maintenance, and technician training. And they have the opportunity to measure the need for trained technicians and expand training opportunities to those. One of the last recommendations is for cities and local authorities. These are very important stakeholders. They can develop heat action plans and expand passive cooling in the form of green spaces and white roofs. They can also use the needs assessment to identify priority actions to protect vulnerable populations. As part of the next steps, we recommend to build capacity and to establish training capacity and centers for promoting focused work on access to cooling in vulnerable countries, either at the country or regional level. We recommend as well as part of the next step to raise awareness and generate knowledge across sectors. There is a need for data, especially better data on agricultural cold chains. There is also a need to improve collaboration between energy and health communities. A gender-based analysis of improved access to cooling is going to be crucial going forward, because for the moment it still is one of the biggest gaps identified. We need to benchmark progress and track finance. We need to track financial flows directed towards access to cooling for vulnerable population, and major financiers can self-report investments. Tracking finance is also something that is still very much so lacking. And so going forward, this is going to be very important. I am now passing the baton again to Ben Hartley, who's going to present you the Cooling for All Needs assessment. But just before that, just also wanted to remind everyone that you can post your questions in the Q&A chat box on your screens. And after Ben's presentation, we're very happy to go through your questions and answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Clotilde. I will speak for the next 5 to 10 minutes on the Cooling for All Needs assessment, which forms one chapter of this report, but is also set up as a tool for governments, industry, cities, NGOs, philanthropy to use on the SE for All website. So for any further resources, you'll be able to find those there. I think just to take a step back, one of the pieces that we have seen is that in the implementation of the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, there's been a lot of success in terms of starting to realize the energy efficiency gains associated with implementing that amendment, particularly in the development of national cooling plans. The issue that we've identified here is that in terms of national cooling plans and in other efforts to promote solutions to access to cooling, these discussions and solutions have focused on projections for equipment sales, GDP, and population growth, without necessarily considering the full diversity of cooling needs that are necessary to provide sustainable access to cooling for all. So while air conditioning and mechanical cooling have an important place in how we deliver sustainable cooling for all, it encompasses a much broader dimension that includes things like human safety in the event of a heat wave, agricultural and medical cold chains that guarantee food and medicines from point of import or growth to market. So the Cooling for All Needs assessment is a response to this. It's a tool that we've developed in partnership with Heriot-Watt University to allow governments, development institutions, and NGOs to do a number of things. The first is establish a baseline for access to cooling. I think one of the pieces that we've seen is that data remains an issue, especially on the granular level, and this is something that was highlighted in this year's report, but also in Chilling Prospects 2018. So this is sort of a blueprint for how entities can begin to collect the data that they need to understand the full scope of cooling need and demand. And finally, by looking across the different needs that we identify in the needs assessment, those who are using it can aggregate policy, technology, and finance options towards those needs, and not just a singular need in terms of space cooling. There may be things that can be singular interventions or technology types that can be applied across different areas of cooling need that includes those agricultural and medical cold chains. So The needs assessment is based on a few principles. I will run through them now. The first is that in order for a country, city, or community to ensure that cooling needs of their population are met, they need to understand what those needs are. Second is that through an assessment across all cooling needs, we can understand demand. We can understand it systematically and we can measure it fully. And only with fully measured demand can a roadmap to delivering access to sustainable cooling for all be developed. Next is that this type of assessment is crucial to the planning and investment required to, A, minimize demand, and B, as I sort of mentioned, aggregate services, and finally to harness new and renewable technologies. And we see this as being something that can be implemented through a national cooling plan or an equivalent set of measures. So if we go to the next slide, the cooling needs that have been identified in the Cooling for All Needs assessment are as follows. The first is human comfort and safety. The second is food, nutrition, security, and agriculture, so covering nutritional needs, but also those of perhaps smallhold farmers. And then finally, health services. So in terms of cold chains that bring vaccines and other temperature-sensitive medical products to rural clinics, as well as the cooling needs of the clinics themselves. So if we go to the next. So here we give you an idea of how this works. You will see at the top the cooling need here, human comfort and safety. And then you'll see across the slide how this is set up. Essentially, for each need, there is 1, 2, or 3 guiding questions. Those guiding questions are linked to indicators which are, to the extent possible, linked to indicators related to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this is a new sort of, cooling is still a nascent field, and while we would have preferred to link all of these indicators to the Sustainable Development Goals, there is data that is outside that scope that is necessary to understand cooling need. So for human comfort and safety, you'll see that the guiding question is, to what extent does the population have access to the space and mobility cooling that is necessary and adequate to maintain safety and productivity at home, in education, and in the work environment, and while moving in between each. So this incorporates those thermal comfort elements, but also importantly, the issue of safety in a heat wave. So the next, we move to food, nutrition, safety, and agriculture. And this asks, are agricultural and fishery income sufficient to keep workers out of absolute and relative poverty? And you'll see the indicators here are linked primarily to SDGs 1, 2, and 9, although I will note that a good constant running throughout is SDG 7, of course. So if we go to the next one, you'll see that in this need, there are multiple guiding questions. So the second, for food, nutrition, safety, and agriculture, is the extent to which the populations have access to the food they need to achieve a healthy diet. Again, linked to Zero Hunger, SDG 7, and SDG 12. Moving to health services, you'll see that the first guiding question relates to national vaccine programs and whether or not they reach their target populations. The next guiding question asks if there are sufficient unbroken cold chains to ensure the provision of medicines and healthcare products. And then finally, the final one asks, are health buildings equipped with the cooling that they need to deliver adequate health services? So this gives you an idea of the scope of the needs assessment, what it asks for in terms of data, and the needs across which we've put out there to say from which they can build a national cooling plan. So see we have a question in the chat. I will come back to it as soon as I'm finished with this section. So if we can just flip to the next one, to sort of summarize on the Cooling for All Needs assessment, what it is a deeper dive across those three areas of needs that I've mentioned. It is linked to the Sustainable Development Goals in a way that allows us to tap into the indicators that are used for the SDGs to begin to start tracking progress against access to cooling and how it's enhanced. And then it is essentially a tool to start the journey in terms of a national cooling plan or an equivalent set of measures that addresses multiple dimensions of cooling need and ultimately allow those entities to start delivering sustainable cooling for all. So in addition to the baseline, of course, it helps measure the full scope of demand. And then finally, if you know this full scope of cooling demand and full scope of cooling need across these three needs, you can address the whole of the problem in terms of your policy, technology, and finance choices when you do. So that sort of wraps up on the Cooling for All Needs assessment. I will note that on our website at the Cooling for All Secretariat, you can find a few additional resources. So in addition to the report series, which you can find there, you will find a needs assessment methodological working paper that's done, of course, in partnership with Heriot-Watt University. You will find a set of PowerPoint slides that goes over much of what I've just covered now on the needs assessment specifically. And then you will find a scorecard, which can be downloaded, and you can put in the data for a country, region, city, whatever you may be working on to begin to benchmark progress and track against your implementation. So the Cooling for All Secretariat here at SC for All, we can be contacted at coolingforall@scforall.org with respect to any questions or comments in implementing the assessment, or assistance finding partners or technical support. Of course, we certainly encourage you to, in addition to checking out our website, to follow us on social media. Our Twitter handle is SCforall.org, and we can be found on Instagram as well, I'm told, as well as Facebook and LinkedIn. So a final note is just that we would just like to thank our funders and supporters, without whom this work could not be made possible, in particular the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program. And then just note, as we are with all of our partners here at Sustainable Energy for All, that in May of next year, from the 26th to the 28th, we will be holding the Sustainable Energy for All Forum in Kigali, Rwanda. So an invitation is extended to those on the call, of course. So with that, just like to say thank you for being a part of the webinar. I think we have a few questions that have come in, and we'll start to address those. Now. And if there are any others that come in, we'll do our best to address them before the hour is out. I think we have about 12 minutes. So.
Yes, thank you, Ben. So we've had some questions coming in. We have a question from Peyton about if we can explain in more details what India has done to reduce the size of its rural population at risk, and if it's possible to quantify the size of that drop.
Yep.
I'll let my colleague Ben go.
Thanks very much.
On this.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Peyton for the question. I think the thing that we would point out in looking at this is that when we talk about the rural poor and when we talk about the urban poor, we sort of categorize those two groups as being at highest risk from not having access to sustainable cooling. And I think, with that in mind, what we do is we think about the dimensions of risk. And for those two, it's living in poverty and having a lack of access to electricity. So in terms of rural people living in poverty, I think the driver for the reduction in that in the reduction of high risk in that is a significant uptick in rural energy access, particularly in India, with Bangladesh and Indonesia showing improvements as well. I think part of it can also be explained through continued urbanization trends in Africa and Asia. But I think it's important to note that while energy access lowers exposure, it does not necessarily imply enhanced access to cooling, given what we sort of understand as the need for tier 2 energy access to operate simple fans, and that goes to tier 3 energy access if you're talking about a refrigerator, and possibly up to tier 4, tier 5 for an air conditioner. Additionally, I think it's important to note that rural people face risks on multiple fronts, not just in terms of heat, but also in terms of a lack of access to cold chains. So I think part of the report also highlights that there are significant concentrations of rural people at highest risk, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, with I believe about 12 countries that had above 60% of their populations at highest risk, which is the urban and the rural poor combined. So I think, yeah, I mean, I know that part of the question was also in relation to Nigeria. Nigeria is one of those countries that is taking steps towards a national cooling plan. They are in the early stages, and I know that they're working with UNDP on this. I think, with Nigeria, as with a number of countries that are similar to them, I think one of the core recommendations from this report is that countries, from the outset should be thinking about these national cooling plans in very comprehensive terms, and not just in terms of the energy efficiency gains that can be created when implementing the Kigali Amendment and the HFC phase-out accompanying it. It should, I think the government of Rwanda set a good example in terms of a holistic approach that prioritizes cold chain and sets in motion long-term strategies for those sectors, in addition to the energy efficiency gains and implementing the Kigali Amendment. So perhaps I'll leave it there, and maybe we can go to the next one.
Yes, thank you, Ben. Another question again from Peyton was if we know about key companies that are embracing the pay for service or the pay-go model. So for this, I can also just, again, since we were mentioning Nigeria, one of the companies I can mention is the Cold Hub. This is an agricultural, this is a SME involved in coaching for agriculture, where they have a pay and plug, let's say, where they offer cold rooms for people to be able to store their produce in a market. I think Cold Hub as well is one of the winners for the Global Leap off-grid refrigeration competition. And also this competition has been focused on off-grid refrigeration. I think some of the winners have embraced this plug and pay or pay as you go, offering cold rooms, especially in agricultural setting. For the cooling as a service approach, I am not sure if they're working with the key companies, but I know that some of the key private sector industries, such as I'm not sure about the names, but I know that given that many of them are now embracing the servitization approach, the cooling as a service is really going to be an approach where people will use this mechanism, pay as you go, to be able to access key efficient financial mechanism. So I would recommend regarding this question, the key companies that are embracing the pay for service model, I would recommend to check what the Global Leap Award is doing, given that they're focused on off-grid refrigeration, and some of them are in this space where this model will be relevant, and the same as the cooling as a service. Both these methods have been, I think, only for 1 or 2 years. So I think they're going in 2020. There's going to be a lot of interesting companies and interesting results coming out from it. We just received another question. If these slides will be accessible after the webinar has finished. Ben has some information about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're happy to share the slides as a PDF as well as the recording that we share this webinar next week. So that's no problem. I think I saw another question come in on India's national cooling plan. What are the targets and the action plans to achieve it, from Rudy? So I'll speak briefly to it. I think we touched on it very briefly early in the presentation. One of the key recommendations out of the Chilling Prospects 2018 report was that countries set targets in terms of these national cooling plans, and we were happy to see those targets be present in India's national cooling plan. So part of it was to reduce cooling demand 20 to 25%, as well as refrigerant demand between 25 and 30%, and reduce cooling energy requirements 25 to 40% from 2017-18 levels by 2037-38. So I think another piece of it that I'll highlight here is that the plan, and you can see this on page 25 of the report as well, is that the plan sort of recognizes a very critical role of skills development and maintenance. There's a goal that they have in this plan in particular of training 100,000 servicing sector technicians by 2022-23. And it is very cognizant of the social benefits of expanding access to cooling, including the contribution of cold chain infrastructure to the goal of doubling farmers' income and reducing food wastage, which I know is important there. So I think there's a little bit of information in the report. I think the Indian government as well does a very good job of summarizing it. And there is information there that can be found. If you're interested further, I would encourage you to look via the ozone unit of the Indian Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change.
Thank you, Ben. So we're receiving quite a lot of different questions here, but we're also it's also not that much. So we're going to spend a little bit more, about 5 minutes, to go through some of them. Let's see, we have I think some of them we could go probably offline, and especially thinking about the question from Leo Blanc. We're happy to go, but we can also, I think my colleague Clotilde can also have a crack at it.
Yeah, so happy to just also go offline. So the question was related to which kind of technology is happening on the field and for cold chains, and what is actually happening more outside and being imported, and what is actually done specifically on site. And what we try to highlight were actually many very basic technology in terms of even cold chain or I meant only thermal appliance. We speak also about a solution, I'm thinking of agro-farming, where the technology is not rocket science, or something that can definitely be developed and done on site. So there is an interesting combination of very efficient new technology, but also technology that is based on local manufacturers and just are able to have solutions that are present on site. It's a very long question to answer, as there are very different aspects to this. So I think we will keep then the next phase of the conversation offline, and we will then get back to you through email. And this is also an encouragement to anyone. We don't want to discourage any question at all. Just also send us email to us, and we have also a cooling for all at sc4all.org. Where you can send us email directly for any additional question you will come up to.
Okay. I see a few others that I can probably or make an attempt to answer fairly quickly with the few minutes that we have left. I'll start in terms of the question in terms of what is the status quo with regards to post-harvest crop handling, how much is wasted and where does it go? There is no simple answer to this as well. It varies by region, and it varies by the level of how strong cold chains are, what crops are being produced, and the levels and farming pattern changes in terms of how weather and economics change what they might produce. The transition from something that requires cold storage, like fruits and temperature-sensitive fruits and vegetables, to cereals, which don't require cold storage. I think the key thing for us, though, is that there's food loss and food wastage. And food loss is that one that is connected with the supply chain, and food wastage is that one connected with more of the human household or business side of consumption. There is a paper by the Global Food Cold Chain Council that is out there. I believe it's from 2015, 2016, which gives you an assessment of how much temperature-sensitive products are lost due to cold chain in different regions. So we can refer you there as well. A next question that I see is, who is responsible to establish the national cooling plan? I think this is something that is understood to be linked, because of the Kigali Agreement, it's very strongly linked to the Montreal Protocol, from which were born national ozone units in many, many different governments. It's a very strong network that works very closely together on the implementation of the Montreal Protocol and the Kigali Agreement. And these units have, from what we've seen, typically been the points in terms of developing national cooling plans. But I think part of our argument here is that they will be more effective if you have buy-in from ministries of energy, if you have buy-in from ministries of agriculture, if you have buy-in from ministries of health and economic development, because it does really require a whole of government strategy. And then the final question is, does SE4All or other NGOs, think tanks, providing governments with expertise and technical assistance to develop cooling plans? I think yes. I would first highlight the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, which has been a pioneer in this, in working through international agencies to help countries develop national cooling plans. Some of those agencies that are providing that technical assistance include UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, UN Environment Program, as well as the World Bank, and in other cases it's in-country specific research institutes that are tasked with supporting the development of those plans, if it's not necessarily something that's on the government's immediate priority list. So I think I don't see any more questions. If there's something that we haven't covered, please, either reach out to us on social media, at our Twitter feed at SE4All.org, or send us an email at coolingforall@se4all.org to have your question answered. So I'll just wrap up and maybe say, on behalf of the cooling team here at SE4All, on behalf of our organization, thank you for joining us today. We hope you found it useful. We hope you'll check out the Cooling for All Needs assessment on our website. And we especially hope that you will help us keep raising awareness of this issue, which in a warming world is an issue of equity. I think we are fond of saying cooling is not a luxury. It may have been considered one up until very recently, but with the extreme temperatures that we're seeing, the impacts that it's having, we have to come to grips with the fact that delivering cooling for all, and sustainable cooling for all, is an issue of equity, and it requires everybody to act, and to act very quickly. So with that, I'll just say thanks again, and we hope you have a good day or evening, and please join us next time and for other SE4All webinars. Thank you very much.